Cast out into the deadly Arctic night by her own husband's violence, Sarah discovered that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. This is the story of a woman who chose the frozen wilderness over the man who was supposed to protect her, and found that the coldest place on earth could harbor the warmest heart she had ever known. Sarah Mitchell pressed her hand against the fresh bruise blooming across her left cheek as she stood shivering in the doorway of the remote trading post that had been her prison for the past 3 years. The icy Arctic wind cut through her thin cotton dress like knives, but the cold outside felt less threatening than the rage that burned in her husband Robert's eyes as he stood behind her, his fists still clenched from their latest argument. At 28, Sarah had learned to read the warning signs in Robert's face, the way his jaw tightened when he drank, the particular shade of red his neck turned when his temper began to rise, the deadly quiet in his voice that meant she had perhaps minutes before his hands would find her again. "Get out." Robert's voice was barely above a whisper, but Sarah heard the menace underneath every syllable. "Get out and don't come back. You're nothing but trouble, always questioning me, always making me look weak in front of the other traders." Sarah's breath formed white clouds in the frigid air as she tried to process what was happening. They were 60 miles from the nearest settlement, surrounded by hundreds of miles of Arctic wilderness where temperatures regularly dropped to 40 below zero. Being cast out in the middle of winter was essentially a death sentence, and they both knew it. But Sarah also knew that staying meant enduring more beatings, more humiliation, more nights spent wondering if Robert's latest drunken rage would be the one that finally killed her. "Robert, please," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling from cold and fear. "It's the middle of winter. There's nowhere to go." "Should have thought of that before you embarrassed me in front of Mackenzie today," Robert snarled, referring to the moment when Sarah had quietly corrected his miscalculation of fur prices in front of the visiting merchant. "Making me look like a fool who can't control his own wife." The accusation was unfair, and they both knew it. Sarah had simply prevented Robert from losing money on a bad deal, but his pride couldn't tolerate being corrected by a woman, especially in front of other men. It was a pattern that had repeated itself countless times during their marriage. Robert's mistakes, followed by his rage at anyone who noticed them, followed by Sarah bearing the physical consequences of his wounded ego. "I was trying to help," Sarah said, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. "I didn't mean to—" Robert's backhand caught her across the mouth before she could finish the sentence, the impact sending her stumbling backward into the snow. The metallic taste of blood filled her mouth as she struggled to her feet, her thin dress already soaking through from the moisture on the ground. "Don't lie to me," Robert spat. "You meant to humiliate me, to show everyone that you think you're smarter than your husband? Well, congratulations, you've proven your point. Now you can be smart all by yourself, out there in the cold." The door slammed shut behind Sarah with a finality that echoed across the empty landscape. She heard the heavy wooden bar slide into place, sealing her out of the only shelter for miles in any direction. The reality of her situation hit her like a physical blow. She was alone in the Arctic wilderness with nothing but the thin dress on her back, facing temperatures that could kill her within hours. For several minutes, Sarah stood frozen in place, not from the cold, but from the sheer impossibility of her circumstances. Part of her wanted to pound on the door, to beg Robert forgiveness, to promise she would never question him again if he would just let her back inside. But a larger part of her, the part that had been growing stronger with each beating, each humiliation, each night spent nursing bruises and wondering if she deserved better, refused to give him that satisfaction. If she was going to die, at least she would die free from the man who had made her life a daily nightmare. At least the Arctic was honest in its hostility. It didn't pretend to love her while systematically breaking her down with words and fists. As darkness began to fall and the temperature dropped even further, Sarah's steps became increasingly unsteady. The thin leather shoes she wore were designed for indoor use only, not for trudging through snow and ice, and she could feel the circulation leaving her feet with each passing minute. Her hands had gone numb despite being tucked under her arms, and the exposed skin on her face felt like it was burning from the cold. But even as hypothermia began to cloud her thinking, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years: a sense of her own agency, her own power to choose her fate. She was no longer a victim trapped in a situation she couldn't control. She was a woman who had made a choice, who had decided that freedom was worth any price, even if that price was her life. The sound of dogs barking in the distance penetrated through the fog of exhaustion and cold that was settling over Sarah's mind. At first, she thought she might be hallucinating, but the sounds grew louder and more distinct, definitely sled dogs, and getting closer. Hope flared in her chest, followed immediately by fear. If Robert had sent someone after her, if he had decided that banishing her wasn't sufficient punishment, then rescue might be worse than freezing to death. But as the dog team crested the ridge ahead of her, Sarah could see immediately that this was not anyone connected to the trading post. The man driving the sled was clearly Inuit, his traditional parka and mukluks marking him as someone from one of the indigenous communities that lived in harmony with this harsh landscape. The dogs were beautiful Arctic animals, their thick coats and confident movements showing that they belonged in this environment in ways that Sarah never could. The man brought his team to a halt just a few yards from where Sarah stood, swaying on her feet, and she got her first clear look at her potential rescuer. He was tall friend Inuit, probably in his mid-30s, with strong features and dark eyes that seemed to take in everything about her situation with a single glance. His weathered face showed no surprise at finding a white woman alone in the wilderness, but there was something in his expression. Concern, perhaps, or professional assessment of a survival situation. "You are lost," he said in careful English, his voice carrying the accent of someone who had learned the language as an adult, but spoke it well. It wasn't a question, but a statement of obvious fact. "Not lost," Sarah managed to say through chattering teeth. "Sent away." The distinction seemed important to her, though she wasn't entirely sure why. Perhaps because being lost implied that she belonged somewhere and had simply taken a wrong turn, while being sent away acknowledged the deliberate cruelty of her situation. The man studied her for a moment, taking in the bruises on her face, her inadequate clothing, the way she swayed from exhaustion and cold. "I am Nuka," he said simply. "You will come with me." Again, it wasn't a question or a request, just a calm statement of what was going to happen. Under normal circumstances, Sarah might have been wary of going anywhere with a stranger, but these were hardly normal circumstances. This man represented her only chance of survival, and she was in no position to be particular about the terms of rescue. Nuka moved with efficient grace, helping Sarah into the sled and wrapping her in thick fur blankets that felt like heaven against her frozen skin. The warmth was almost painful as it began to return sensation to her extremities, but it was the most wonderful pain she had ever experienced. As the sled began to move, carried swiftly across the snow by the powerful dog team, Sarah felt consciousness beginning to slip away from her. "Where?" she tried to ask, but Nuka's voice reached her through the gathering darkness. "Safe," he said, and somehow that single word contained more comfort and reassurance than any lengthy explanation could have provided. For the first time in years, Sarah allowed herself to completely let go, to trust someone else to take care of her without expecting payment and pain and humiliation. The village that Sarah awakened in was unlike anything she had experienced during her time in the Arctic. Where the trading post had been a rough collection of hastily constructed buildings designed for temporary occupation by men who planned to extract what profit they could before moving on, this community showed evidence of generations of careful adaptation to the environment. The dwelling where she found herself was warm and comfortable, with walls that seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the wind outside, and a design that worked with the Arctic climate rather than fighting against it. An elderly Inuit woman was sitting beside the sleeping platform where Sarah lay, her weathered hands working on what appeared to be a piece of clothing made from some kind of fur. When she noticed that Sarah was awake, the woman's face creased into a smile that transformed her entire appearance. "Nuka said you would wake today," the woman said, in English that was more heavily accented than Nuka's, but perfectly understandable. I am Auki. You are in my home, and you are safe here. The simple declaration brought tears to Sarah's eyes, though she couldn't entirely explain why. Perhaps it was the matter-of-fact kindness in Auki's voice, or the way the woman's presence seemed to radiate the kind of maternal warmth that Sarah had never experienced from her own mother. Or perhaps it was simply the relief of waking up alive when she had been certain she was going to die. "How long have I been here?" Sarah asked, struggling to sit up and discovering that her body felt weak but no longer desperately cold. 3 days, Auki replied, setting aside her sewing to help Sarah adjust the furs that covered her. "You had the cold sickness, what you call frostbite. Nuka brought you here just in time. Another hour in the wind and you would not have awakened." The casual way Auki spoke about Sarah's near-death experience somehow made it easier to process than dramatic declarations would have been. This was a community that understood survival, that dealt with life and death situations as natural parts of existence in the Arctic rather than as extraordinary crises. "I need to thank him," though I wasn't sure how someone thanked another person for saving their life. "And I need to figure out what happens now." Auki's expression grew thoughtful. "Nuko will return soon from hunting. He has been asking about you, wanting to know if you are strong enough to talk. I think he has questions about how you came to be alone in the storm." The reminder of her circumstances brought a fresh wave of anxiety. Sarah had been so focused on the simple relief of being alive and warm that she hadn't fully considered what would happen next. She couldn't stay with these people indefinitely, they owed her nothing, and she had no way to contribute to the community or repay their kindness. But she also couldn't return to the trading post, couldn't go back to Robert and the life that had nearly killed her in more ways than one. "I don't know what I'm going to do," Sarah admitted, the words coming out in a rush. "I can't go back to where I came from, but I don't have anywhere else to go either. I don't even know where I am or how far we are from the nearest settlement." Auki studied Sarah's face with the kind of patient attention that suggested she was seeing more than just the immediate situation. "Tell me about the marks on your face," she said gently, "and about why a woman would choose to walk into a blizzard rather than stay where she was." The invitation to share her story was both welcome and terrifying. Sarah had spent so long hiding the truth about her marriage, making excuses for Robert's behavior and minimizing the abuse she endured, that she wasn't sure she remembered how to tell the truth about her own life. But something about Auki's presence made honesty feel not just possible, but necessary. Slowly, haltingly, Sarah began to describe her marriage to Robert, the gradual escalation of his violence, the isolation she had experienced at the remote trading post where no one questioned the man's right to discipline his wife as he saw fit. She told Auki about the years of walking on eggshells, trying to anticipate and prevent Robert's rages, accepting blame for his failures and frustrations. "He wasn't always like this," Sarah found herself saying, falling into the familiar pattern of making excuses even as she tried to be honest. "When we first married, he could be kind sometimes. It was only when he started drinking more, when business got difficult." Auki held up a hand, stopping Sarah mid-sentence. "In my culture," the older woman said carefully, "we believe that a man who strikes a woman shows that he is weak inside, that he cannot control himself. Such a man brings shame to his family and his community. A strong man protects women and children, not hurts them." The simple statement cut through years of self-doubt and self-blame that Robert had carefully cultivated in Sarah's mind. She had been told so many times that she was the problem, that her behavior provoked his anger, that she needed to try harder to be a better wife, that she had almost forgotten that the responsibility for violence lay with the person who chose to commit it. "But I did make mistakes," Sarah said, still struggling to fully accept that she was not to blame for her own abuse. "I questioned him in front of other people. I didn't always do things the way he wanted." "And for this, you deserve to be beaten?" Alki asked, her voice gentle but firm. You deserve to be thrown out to die in the cold? Put so bluntly, the answer was obvious, but it was an answer that Sarah had been trained not to give for so long that it felt revolutionary to even think it. No, she whispered, and then more strongly, no, I didn't deserve any of it. Alki nodded with satisfaction, as if Sarah had passed some kind of test. Good. Now you are ready to begin healing, not just your body, but your spirit as well. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of dogs outside, followed by a voice calling something in Inuktitut. Alki smiled and began gathering up her sewing materials. Nuka returns, she said. He will want to see that you are well and to hear your story for himself. In our community, when someone is in trouble, everyone must understand the situation so that everyone can help decide what should be done. The idea of having her personal business discussed by an entire community would have horrified Sarah under normal circumstances, but she was beginning to understand that normal circumstances no longer applied to her life. She was completely dependent on the kindness of strangers, in a culture she didn't understand, facing a future she couldn't predict. Traditional notions of privacy and independence seemed less important than survival and healing. Nuka entered the dwelling with the quiet confidence that seemed to characterize all his movements. He was even more impressive than Sarah remembered from their brief encounter in the storm. Tall and powerfully built, with intelligent dark eyes and hands that showed the calluses and scars of someone who worked with tools and weapons as natural extensions of his body. But it was his expression that struck Sarah most forcefully. Patient, thoughtful, and completely without the anger or judgment she had learned to expect from men. You look much better, Nuka said, settling onto a pile of furs across from where Sarah sat. Alki says you will make a full recovery from the cold damage. Thanks to you, Sarah replied, meeting his eyes directly in a way she had not been able to do with Robert for years. I know you saved my life. I just wish I knew how to repay that kind of debt. Nuka waved away her thanks with a gesture that suggested such gratitude was unnecessary. In the Arctic, we help each other survive. Today I help you, tomorrow you help someone else, next week someone helps me. This is how communities stay alive in places where individuals cannot. The philosophy was so different from the competitive individualism that had characterized Sarah's previous life that it took her a moment to fully understand what he was saying. At the trading post, every interaction was transactional, every relationship based on what one person could extract from another. The idea of helping someone simply because they needed help without expecting immediate compensation was almost foreign to her experience. Alki says you want to hear about how I ended up in the storm, Sarah said, steeling herself to tell her story again.
Nuka nodded. If you are willing to share, but understand that I ask not from curiosity, but because I need to know if there will be trouble coming to our village because we helped you. If your husband is the kind of man who would bring violence here to reclaim his property, then we must be prepared. The casual way Nuka referred to her as Robert's property should have been offensive, but Sarah understood that he was simply acknowledging the legal and social realities of her situation, rather than endorsing them. Under the law, she was indeed Robert's property, and he had every right to reclaim her if he chose to do so. He might come looking for me, Sarah admitted. Not because he loves me or misses me, but because he can't stand the idea of being defied. And he has connections with other traders, government officials. If he decides to make trouble, then we will deal with trouble when it comes, Nuka said simply. Our people have been dealing with trouble from outsiders for many generations. We are still here. There was no boasting in his voice, just a calm statement of fact that somehow conveyed more confidence than any amount of blustering could have achieved. Sarah found herself believing that this community could indeed protect her from Robert if necessary, not because they were more violent or better armed than he was, but because they were united in ways that her husband's world of competing individuals could never match. Over the following days, as Sarah's physical strength returned and she began to move around the village, she discovered just how different this community was from anything she had previously experienced. The village operated on principles of cooperation and shared responsibility that seemed to make traditional authority structures unnecessary. Decisions were made through discussion and consensus rather than by decree from a single leader, and everyone's voice was heard, regardless of their age or gender. Women held positions of real influence and respect, their opinions valued equally with those of men in matters that affected the community. Children were treated as full members of society whose contributions were important rather than as property to be controlled by their parents. Elders were honored for their wisdom and experience rather than dismissed as burdens who consumed resources without producing anything valuable. Most remarkably, from Sarah's perspective, conflicts were resolved through dialogue and mediation, rather than through violence or the imposition of authority. She watched in amazement as a dispute between two hunters over territorial rights was settled through patient discussion that took into account not just the immediate interests of the individuals involved, but the long-term welfare of the entire community. "How do you make it work?" Sarah asked Auki one evening as they prepared food together. "How do you keep people from taking advantage of the cooperation, from being selfish or destructive?"
Aki considered the question carefully while she worked.
Perhaps because we understand that survival depends on everyone working together, she said finally. In the city, one person can survive by taking from many others. Here, if the community fails, everyone dies. This makes cooperation necessary, not just nice. The explanation made sense, but Sarah suspected there was more to it than simple necessity. She had seen communities under stress before, had watched how crisis could bring out the worst in people rather than the best. There was something deeper at work here, some fundamental difference in how these people understood their relationships to each other and to the world around them. Part of that difference, she was beginning to realize, was reflected in their relationship with the Arctic environment itself. Where Robert and the other traders saw the landscape as an enemy to be conquered, or a resource to be exploited, the Inuit community understood themselves as part of an interconnected system that required balance and respect, rather than dominance. "The land teaches us," Nuka explained when Sarah asked him about this difference. "It teaches us that everything is connected, that what affects one part affects all parts. It teaches us patience, because forcing solutions usually creates bigger problems. It teaches us humility, because no matter how strong or clever we think we are, the Arctic is stronger and more clever." These lessons, Sarah realized, extended far beyond survival techniques or hunting strategies. They shaped how the community approached every aspect of life, from child rearing to conflict resolution to the treatment of visitors like herself. The same patience and respect that was necessary for successful hunting was applied to human relationships, creating a social environment that felt completely different from anything Sarah had known. But perhaps the most significant difference was in how the community viewed individual worth and potential. Where Sarah's previous life had been defined by constant criticism and efforts to make her smaller and more compliant, her time in the village was characterized by encouragement and support for her to become more fully herself. "You have healing hands," Auki observed one day, after watching Sarah help tend to a child who had injured himself while playing. "And a gentle spirit that makes people feel safe. These are valuable gifts that could serve our community well." The idea that she had gifts worth sharing was revolutionary for Sarah. Robert had spent years convincing her that she was nothing but a burden, a source of problems and complications that made his life more difficult. The possibility that she might actually contribute something positive to a community, that her presence might be genuinely welcomed rather than merely tolerated, opened up possibilities she had never dared to imagine. As weeks passed and winter began to give way to spring, Sarah found herself settling into the rhythms of village life with a sense of belonging she had never experienced before.
She learned traditional skills from the women, contributed to the endless tasks of food preparation and equipment maintenance that kept the community functioning, and discovered that she had a natural aptitude for working with the children, who seemed drawn to her quiet manner and infinite patience. But it was her growing relationship with Nuka that created the deepest changes in how Sarah understood herself and her possibilities. Unlike Robert, who had been attracted to her initially because he thought she would be easy to control, Nuka seemed to appreciate her strength even as he supported her healing from the damage that strength had caused her. "You survived years of treatment that would have broken many people," he told her one evening, as they walked along the shore of the partially frozen river that ran past the village. "And when you finally had enough, you chose freedom even when it meant risking death. That takes courage that most people never have to find. I never thought of it as courage, Sarah replied, still struggling to see her own actions in positive terms. It felt more like desperation, like I just couldn't take any more. Courage often feels like desperation, Nuka said thoughtfully. The difference is what you do when you reach that point. Some people give up completely. Some people turn their pain on others who are weaker. You chose to risk everything for the chance to live differently. That is courage. The conversation took place on one of those magical Arctic evenings when the light seemed to last forever, painting the landscape in shades of gold and pink that made even the harshest terrain look beautiful. Sarah had never experienced anything like the peace she felt walking beside this man who seemed to understand her better than she understood herself, who saw possibilities in her that she was just beginning to glimpse. "What happens when summer comes?" Sarah asked, voicing the question that had been growing in her mind for weeks. "When the rivers are open and travel becomes easier, will your people want me to move on?" Nuka stopped walking and turned to face her directly. "Is that what you want to do? Move on?" The question forced Sarah to confront feelings she had been afraid to acknowledge fully. "No," she said quietly, "I don't want to leave. But I don't know if I have the right to stay or what staying would mean." "In our culture," Nuka said carefully, "when someone saves your life, you become responsible for how that life is lived afterward. I pulled you from the storm, so your future is connected to mine whether we choose it or not." Sarah felt her heart racing at the implications of what he was saying. "And what would you choose if the decision were yours alone?" Nuka's answer came without hesitation. "I would choose to have you stay, not as a visitor or a refugee, but as a full member of our community. As my partner, if you are willing."
The proposal was unlike anything Sarah had ever imagined receiving.
There was no possessiveness in Nuka's words, no suggestion that he wanted to own or control her. Instead, he was offering partnership, equality, the chance to build something together based on mutual respect and shared commitment to the community's welfare. "I've never been in a relationship based on choice before," Sarah admitted. "I don't know if I know how to be a good partner when I'm not being forced to be there." "Then we will learn together," Nuka replied simply. "And if you discover that this life is not what you want, you will be free to choose differently. No one who joins our community becomes trapped here." The promise of freedom was what finally allowed Sarah to accept the offer of love. She had learned that relationships based on coercion inevitably became prisons, but a relationship that guaranteed her right to leave might actually be one she could choose to stay in. The ceremony that united Sarah and Nuka took place during the brief Arctic summer when the entire community could gather outdoors to celebrate under the midnight sun. Sarah wore traditional clothing that the village women had made for her, incorporating both Inuit designs and elements that honored her own heritage. The ceremony itself was unlike any wedding Sarah had witnessed before. Instead of focusing on promises of obedience and permanence, it emphasized partnership, mutual support, and shared commitment to the community's welfare. "We join our lives not just to each other, but to the life of our people," Nuka said in both English and Inuktitut, ensuring that everyone present could understand the vows being made. "We promise to care for each other and for all those who depend on us." Sarah's own vows reflected the transformation she had undergone since arriving in the village. "I promise to use my gifts in service of our community, to learn from the wisdom of our elders, and to help create a future where all people can live with dignity and respect." The words meant more to her than any traditional wedding vows could have, because they represented not just personal commitment, but a pledge to live according to values that honored human worth rather than hierarchy and control. The years that followed brought challenges and joys that Sarah could never have anticipated during her years of suffering at the trading post. She and Nuka developed a partnership that combined their different strengths and perspectives to serve the community more effectively than either could have done alone.
Sarah's formal education and knowledge of the outside world proved valuable in helping the village navigate increasing contact with government officials and commercial interests, while Nuka's deep understanding of traditional ways ensured that adaptation never came at the cost of cultural identity. Their children grew up bilingual and bicultural, equally comfortable with traditional Inuit practices and modern technologies, equally capable of surviving in the Arctic wilderness and negotiating with bureaucrats from the outside world.
The oldest, a daughter they named Kira, became particularly skilled at bridging different worlds, eventually serving as a translator and advocate for indigenous communities throughout the territory. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact of Sarah's escape from her abusive marriage was the example it provided for other women facing similar situations. Word of her story spread through the networks that connected Arctic communities, and over the years, several other women arrived at the village seeking refuge from violent husbands or impossible circumstances. Each time, the community responded with the same matter-of-fact kindness that had saved Sarah's life, providing shelter and support while helping newcomers figure out how to rebuild their lives on their own terms. Some eventually moved on to other communities or returned to the outside world, but others stayed and became permanent members of the village, contributing their own gifts and perspectives to the ongoing life of the community. "You started something," Alki told Sarah years later as they watched a group of women working together to prepare food for a community celebration. "You showed that it was possible to choose freedom over safety, to risk everything for the chance to live differently. That gave other women courage to make their own choices." The observation filled Sarah with a sense of purpose that went far beyond her personal happiness. Her decision to walk into the Arctic storm rather than endure another beating had seemed at the time like a desperate act of individual rebellion. But it had become something larger, a demonstration that change was possible, that even the most powerless people had the ability to transform their circumstances if they were willing to risk everything for freedom. The trading post where Sarah had spent her years of suffering eventually closed when Robert's drinking and violent temper drove away too many customers and partners. He left the territory without ever learning what had become of the wife he had cast out into the storm, perhaps believing that she had died as he had intended, perhaps simply not caring enough to investigate. Sarah occasionally wondered what had become of him, but the wondering was more academic than emotional. The woman who had been beaten and terrorized by Robert Mitchell felt like a different person from the one who now helped lead a thriving Arctic community. The transformation had been gradual but complete, involving not just escape from an abusive situation, but the discovery of possibilities she had never known existed. "Do you ever regret the choice you made that night?" Nuka asked her one evening as they sat together watching the northern lights dance across the sky above their village. "I regret that it took me so long to make it," Sarah replied without hesitation. "I regret all the years I wasted believing that I deserved the treatment I was receiving. All the times I chose familiar misery over unknown possibilities."
And if you could go back and warn your younger self, what would you tell her? Sarah considered the question carefully before answering. "I would tell her that she was stronger than she knew, that she deserved better than she was getting, and that sometimes the most dangerous choice is actually the safest one in the long run." The conversation took place more than 20 years after Sarah's escape from the trading post, and she reflected on how different her life had become from anything she could have imagined during those dark years of abuse and isolation. The woman who had once believed she was worthless had become a respected community leader, a loving partner, a devoted mother, and a source of hope for other women facing impossible circumstances. Most importantly, she had learned that love didn't have to be a source of fear and pain, that relationships could be based on mutual respect and support rather than dominance and control. The marriage she had built with Nuka had shown her what partnership could look like when both people were free to choose their level of commitment rather than being trapped by legal and social constraints. Their love had grown stronger over the years rather than deteriorating, deepened by shared challenges and mutual support rather than corroded by resentment and abuse. They had created a life together that honored both their individual growth and their commitment to something larger than themselves. As Sarah watched the aurora borealis paint the Arctic sky in brilliant colors, she marveled at the journey that had brought her from the darkest night of her life to this moment of complete peace and contentment.
The woman who had once stumbled through the blizzard expecting to die had instead discovered how to truly live. Cast out into the deadly Arctic night by her own husband's violence, Sarah had discovered that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. She had learned that the coldest place on earth could harbor the warmest heart, that the most dangerous choice could lead to the safest haven, and that the end of one life could be the beginning of a much better one. The stubborn courage that had carried her into the storm had also carried her through the process of healing and transformation that followed. She had proven to herself and others that no situation was so hopeless that change was impossible. No person so powerless that freedom was out of reach. Her story became part of the oral tradition not just of her adopted village, but of the broader network of communities throughout the Arctic region, passed down through generations as an example of how strength could triumph over violence, how love could conquer fear, and how the most desperate choices sometimes led to the most beautiful outcomes. They had said that a woman alone in the Arctic winter had no chance of survival. But Sarah Mitchell had discovered something stronger than the deadliest storm: the power of human courage to create new possibilities, even in the most impossible circumstances.